My name is Brian Flamme. I'm a pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Roswell, New Mexico, and I have been thinking a lot about why the things that David has been telling us should matter to people who fear God, to people who love God, and trust in Him to protect us from all of the evil powers that are out there. Like, why should we be afraid of the government? We shouldn't, of course. Why should we be afraid of these big corporations that can log our keystrokes, collect data? We shouldn't fear them, of course. We should only fear God, right? And so it's one of the questions that I've been meditating on for a couple of years. I know that Pastor Emilius has been pushing me in this direction, along with one of our mutual friends, to come up with an adequate explanation, because a Christian should really be fearless in the face of government and or business surveillance. Now, I've noticed that there's a strange contradiction with how people interact with web browsers, with messengers, with social media. We know that the corporations behind the tools and technologies we use make their money by gathering, indexing, and selling our personal information to marketers. We know that as soon as we open a new tab, check our email and ask Alexa for pancake recipes, or watch a video, we are being identified, watched, categorized, and analyzed. And yes, I know we can exercise a modicum of control of how your data is gathered, and possibly, if you're exceptionally careful, your identity can be masked, at least for a little while. But I want you to understand that the tech folks are kind of creating a sense of it's just you and your screen. It's a very intimate relationship. When you use your screen, when you use your computer, how far away is that screen? It's not quite like using your television when you're gathered around with your family, right? And you put on the Lord of the Rings, if you're nerdy like me, and you all sit down and enjoy some good, film. No, when it's just you and your screen, when you're opening up that browser, it's not typically a family affair, but you have your phone right up to your face. You're sitting at your desk, and it's just you and a screen. And it creates, and I don't necessarily imply malign intentions to people I don't know, but it does seem to create and to foster this idea that I'm alone here. It's just me. The question came up during David's presentation. Why is it necessarily bad? Robin Phillips brought this up. Why is this necessarily bad if people can backtrack searches to help find a criminal? That's a valid question, one that's worth consideration. One of the things that David was pushing towards in his answer was that, people don't understand necessarily when they're typing in search queries, that there's a whole host of people who are watching. You're not by yourself. Now, David has demonstrated repeatedly over the past few years that big tech is very used to saying one thing about protecting your privacy, and they often end up doing another. Their messaging apps are notorious for logging and storing your conversational data. This means that there's always another set of ears listening in, another set of eyes watching. Even when you try to clear your archives and caches, how can you be sure that there's not another copy of your data somewhere else? Worse is the fact that some of big tech's biggest video outlets take what they know about their users to manipulate the minds and the wills of our children. You'll remember that during the height of the COVID hysteria, everybody's location data was also being gathered without them allowing for it. It was being gathered from their cell phones and shared with the government. And yet, without a second thought, people continue to interface with browsers and apps as if it's just them and their screen. They freely share phone numbers, credit card information, their kids' pictures, without giving a second thought about what that screen really means. They click through the terms of use boxes, assuming that all that legal jargon doesn't really matter, it doesn't really apply to me. So it's hardly a wonder that it's been suggested that privacy, as it used to be understood, has ceased to exist or matter. I suppose it could be argued that making use of the technologies is choosing to open up your life to untold numbers of interested groups who want to watch you, to log, categorize, analyze you. But how can it be a rational, real choice if without creating a profile, having an email, signing up for a certain service, you can't get a job, apply for a mortgage, communicate with your parents, or shepherd the members of your congregation? Now, I suppose you could think of this as the technical problem of privacy. The fact that it may not exist in the spaces where we act like it does. Now, there is also a theological problem that I've been wrestling with, as I've mentioned, and that is that the Christian life is open. It exists before God and before men. There is no such thing as a life that is not under judgment, both from God and from men. In fact, the Christian who lives under grace should encourage the gaze of others as he lives his life to the glory of God and to the benefit of his neighbors. His whole life is an apologetic of godliness. St. Peter writes, "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." St. Peter doesn't say, don't do this sometimes. He speaks in such a way that he wants you to be aware that the Gentiles are always watching, that God is always seeing you as well. So if the government wants to spy on Christian emails, let it. Even those whose desire is to find and to persecute Christians will learn from watching the Christians about how Christ's mercy shapes their attitude toward the fellow saints and even their love toward their enemies. If the businesses want to monitor a Christian's online activities for marketing purposes, well, by monitoring keystrokes or whatever else, they'd probably find that you're addicted to Bible commentaries, devotionals for the honestly working men. Now, this attitude that I've heard from brother pastors makes some very excellent points. It calls upon men to give an account to others and to God for their use of these online tools and technologies. Do they use it for good works? Or do they use it for sin? If it is for sin, then of course they want everything to be private, anonymous, and secure. Otherwise, they would shatter their marriage, lose their job, their reputation among their friends. For such hypocrites, it is better for them to assume the all-seeing eye of the government, and that big tech is indeed a surrogate for God to keep them from acting as if they could truly be alone and free of God's knowledge and judgment when it's just them and the screen. Honorable men act always as if they're being watched. They expect and welcome judgment. They live as an example to others, and this seems like an effective condemnation against us using VPNs, secure messaging services, and even, yes, the Tor browser that came up. It makes a good point also about the openness of the Christian life and the willingness to suffer all for the sake of confessing Christ and his gospel. But this is hardly everything that needs to be said about the need for privacy, even if it's supposedly unneeded. Because the scriptures are full of godly men and women keeping truths about themselves, others, and about circumstances from the wrong ears and from the wrong eyes. Now, are these efforts misguided or vain? Also, the openness of the Christian doctrine and life is also to be balanced by the biblical commands to do prayer and almsgiving in secret. It's fascinating to me that the scriptures have a category of secretness. and in fact, for keeping your neighbor's reputation intact despite your knowledge of his or her sin. And this is for the pastors in the room, for keeping the sins spoken to you in confidence, always, always from the ears of others. So this presentation will consider the classical origins and articulation for the right to privacy. It will consider the biblical examples and responses, and will attempt to suggest a way forward for articulating an evangelical justification for privacy. So, why should privacy matter? If you ask a modern person, a secular person, I'm sure you'll hear something about, well, I have a right to privacy, right? Just like they have a right to free speech, a right to happiness, a right to, well, you name it, right? What was it, down in Peru? They just came out with like a whole list of a Bill of Rights, and there's like 200 and some odd on this bill that they passed through their government. When the politicians and philosophers get together to draft broad international agreements on the importance of privacy, they affirm this intuition. They ground the right, and this is important to note, in dignity and in autonomy. Now, these things sound good, I guess, but what do they mean? Dignity, of course, speaks to the inherent value and worth of the person. Autonomy is the person's right to, quote, determine the content of his life, himself. When the United Nations and global entities come together to make declarations and statements about the universal rights to privacy, usually in connection with healthcare, as we have it here in this country with our HIPAA laws, they argue that every individual has a personal space, that he or she has an autonomous decision-making right to that space. Now, how do we get to the conclusion that human beings are autonomous, masters of our own bodies, masters of our own minds and wills? Did privacy arise after we figured that concept out? Or was it applied later after privacy was already a thing in the Western world? Now, it seems to me like privacy is prior to any modern ideas of autonomy. Robert Neville has written about the development of privacy as a concept in ancient Greece, when every citizen was required to give a portion of time and energy devoted to the public deliberation and welfare. So not only did the citizen have to be concerned about his household, he had to spend at least a little bit of time being concerned about the households of everybody, part of the polis. The problem, as Neville wisely points out, is that not every citizen had the capacity to skillfully engage in public affairs. Fair enough. Now, during the Enlightenment, the political philosophies of Hobbes and Locke helped to settle the dilemma. Hobbes argued that the interest of all is best served by ceding to a sovereign the power to cause violence and to make laws restricting interactions. Now, whatever is not, therefore, under the power of the government, through the ceding of authority on behalf of the whole, remained private or within a person's own power. Locke, for his part, linked public life to self-interest. The citizen was the owner and the master of his own body and the extension of his body and the affairs of the body, like his property. Now, he could, according to Locke, delegate that authority to representatives chosen to represent him and his interests in a communal body. For better or for worse, the Lockean heritage continues to this day by defining man as sovereign of himself and of his own affairs. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are firmly within this tradition. We see it reflected particularly in American Western individualism. Now, it may not be as present in the cities of Colorado, inundated with transplants from California, but the values of independence and self-sufficiency, that I am the master of my body, my family, my domain. I can shoot a gun on my property if I want to. Nobody else can stop me. Now, I can assure you these are all alive and well in rural areas, especially in the places in New Mexico where I come from. Now, this is how autonomy is connected to privacy. One scholar writes that autonomy supports identity formation, enabling us to choose how we present ourselves to others, supporting intimate relationships, and protecting us from manipulation. In the medical fields, you could see how this pertains to having a say over your own treatment and who gets to know about the privileged conversation between you and your doctor. In the realm of social media, you presumably ought to be able to choose and have control over what face you show the world. Now that's kind of rich. I mean, one of the things that David could have spent a long time talking about is the fact that, and he mentioned it, that when you generate a profile on Facebook, right, and populate it with your image and your information, Facebook already has a profile of you anyway. So this speaks to that previous point that, in fact, privacy based on like human autonomy in a digital space is really just doesn't exist. We'll talk about that more. Now, as far as the value of dignity, it is commendable that the secular West has continued the language of a person's dignity and that a person indeed has objective value in him or herself. However, cut off from dignity's true origin as one's status as a creature and saint under God, that value is only vaguely known now, and it's quickly, I suggest to you, losing relevance. One's dignity, if you believe the philosophy and the language of critical theory, which has come to dominate politics, academics, and news media, your value, your dignity is established by your subjugated status. And the intersection of those various oppressions it's significant for making you who you are as a real being of substance, of weight. And it justifies extraordinary uses of power to overthrow your would-be oppressors. Now, this is, of course, a variation of Marxist dialectic. It vilifies men and exalts others with the arbitrary categories of oppressors and oppressed. It desires nothing but conflict and revolution. If you fail to define yourself according to their dialectic as an oppressed person, then you have no dignity. And you are open and deserve the assaults of the oppressed. Now, despite these waves of change that are going on in the world at this moment, we still have the habits of recognizing dignity in the people that we come into contact with every day. Courtesy is still a thing. God be praised. Even if the foundations of these habits are gradually crumbling away. For now, autonomy and dignity might be sufficient in secular conversation where the foundations of the universal rights are seldom discussed in depth or challenged. But what worth does man, I'm speaking now from a Christian perspective, what worth does man have apart from the God who created him, or Christ who redeemed him? Asserting these values and subsequent rights does not work for Christians who know that man is not autonomous, but we are very much under God's law, both the moral precepts of the Ten Commandments and the orders of creation which define and sustain life. Dr. Chuck Aaron from the St. Louis Seminary has done good work on articulating a Christian perspective on autonomy, especially with regard to the rise of the rights to commit suicide or for medical providers to enable euthanasia, which is legal in this state, sadly. He draws us to the most fundamental statement of faith the children learn to memorize from the first article of the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. What does this mean? I believe that God has made me and all creatures, that he has given me my body and soul, eyes, ears, and all my members, my reason and all my senses, and still takes care of them. This is wonderful, good, amazing. It also teaches there is no secular safe space from which we can understand ourselves apart from God. The words of the first article, along with its explanation, show how this simple biblical doctrine of creation is essential to understanding who we are, what we have been given, and what we are worth. Whatever anyone else can say about you, they can say nothing better or more comforting that you are God's creature. You are not a cosmic accident. You are not a divine afterthought. As the psalmist says to God, you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. The doctrine of creation and the essential distinction between creature and creator keeps God from being like us and from us being like God. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, says the Lord. Neither are your ways my ways. Dr. Aaron writes, God alone, therefore, is completely autonomous and independent of the world. He alone is totally self-sufficient and self-determining. In this way, the doctrine of creation stands as the great bulwark against idolatry. Now, the statement about creation and idolatry is profound. When our first parents took upon themselves to judge God's word, to judge God himself, to become a law unto themselves, to become autonomous, they transgressed from life into death. They fell into sin and death because they strove in their hearts to be divine, to have godlike wisdom. That's what Satan promised them. And in their ambition to become like God, they lost fellowship and union with their Creator. The truth is, unless we are blessed, guided, and bound by God's divine word, mankind dies both physically and spiritually. Now, hearing this irritates the flesh that's been brought up to here, that you can make yourself into anything that you desire, that you can have godlike power over how you present yourself to the world. And it's really interesting how, in setting up a profile using social media, you do have a weird godlike power to pick this face, not that face that showed up in that picture, to display to the world. You have this godlike power that's presented to you to curate your timeline, to satisfy any fleshly desire within moments of making an online purchase. You can fashion your own, apparently, this is something that's coming. I don't know if they're really doing this. You can fashion your own perfect, ideal worlds in the metaverse. You can even turn, apparently, if you desire it enough, or even if you've just suggested it, you can turn from a man to a woman with a few surgical incisions. This is what we've been told. To see ourselves at the apex of our own pyramids of existence comes as naturally to us as Westerners, as Americans, as breathing. To think and act in such an autonomous way is, as the scriptures teach, sin. We are creatures. We have been bought with a price. We must consider ourselves at God's mercy. Consequently, if we see ourselves as a creature and a saint, our eyes are opened to perceive and to know our fellow creatures who share in our struggles and our joys upon this earth. So autonomy is not the foundation for privacy, and dignity is a dream unless it is grounded in the fact of our creation and redemption. Yet privacy still exists as a reality among God's people, and even for the person of Christ himself. Now, when I talk about privacy, I don't only mean like privileged information, but I also mean the things that people do in secret. You know, they take actions that they intentionally keep from the attention of others. And I think that also includes and implies privacy, traditionally understood as like withheld information. Since I think clandestine, and for those of you who are wondering about this, is there really a distinction between privacy and secrecy? One scholar points out that privacy, just food for thought, is a positive status, whereas secrecy is a negative. So privacy speaks about that which is the individual's and with whom he desires to share it, whereas secrecy is compromising. It's your shameful parts. And if your secrets get out, you're vulnerable to attack. Now, from the Holy Scriptures, we heard this, of course, from the Vesper service this evening. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. The implication being, don't go spilling secrets. The things you know, this private, secret things you know about other people. From the books of Moses, we find all kinds of interesting examples of parts of persons that are being covered, that are being kept from the full disclosure and the knowledge of others. Now, anyone who's read through the first chapters of Genesis will quickly come to the conclusion that they are theologically necessary. They conceal and withhold knowledge of a part of ourselves that, yes, God intended for honorable use, but after the fall to sin, we intend for dishonorable use. Even after Adam and Eve, of course, sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves and their parts, it's interesting that after God speaks the first gospel to them, the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. He doesn't say, well, now that I've given you the gospel, you no longer need those coverings. God, in fact, does one better. He's like, those things will fall off too quickly. Let me give you better ones. You'll need these. The same theme continues, of course, with Noah's exposure. You remember after the flood, he got drunk and he was discovered by his sons. One son laughed, and another one does the godly thing. He covered his shame, parts of himself that were not for other people. A different kind of example comes, of course, from the Lord's confusing of people's tongues at Babel, which seems to have, of course, less with respecting everybody's right to privacy, but it does prevent sin by making it so that people can't understand and share knowledge between one another. He limits their communicative ability, and that is, in fact, in that situation, for those sinners, a very good thing. We also know about Joseph and how he conceals his identity from his brothers for a time until at the right moment, at the best moment, he reveals himself. We know that the Egyptian midwives not only disobeyed Pharaoh's policy of Hebrew genocide through abortion, but they also boldly lied to their sovereign to conceal their resistance. Moses himself was saved by intentional concealment in the basket floated down the Nile. Outside the Torah, we're surrounded with more examples, of course, of concealed knowledge. No one would deny of Rahab's hiding of the spies is in fact a good work. Of course it is. She feared God. That's why she hid the spies. As soon as Saul's anger against David became murderous, what's the godly thing to do? Well, Jonathan said, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place. Hide yourself. And of course, there's also Mordecai's advice to Esther to keep her whereabouts and her situation secret from her kindred when she's taken into the Persian king's house. In the New Testament, we see the wise men concealing the discovery of Christ from Herod. The Holy Family themselves were concealed from Herod in their flight to Egypt. It's easy to see that Jesus was not universally available at all times. There were times when he hid himself from the Jews, when their anger against him intensified to become murderous. There's the example of his messianic secret. He did not, in fact, want his full identity and purpose to be known until the right time. That is, after his crucifixion, his death, and his resurrection. Notice that not every instance of self-concealment is motivated by danger or exceptional circumstance. From time to time, Jesus would go off by himself to pray. That's a positive thing. That's a good thing. Sometimes we know what he said to the Father, like what he said to the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane when he was off by himself. The other disciples are asleep. Other times, Jesus prays to the Father. We don't know. Jesus intentionally controlled who possessed the meanings of the parables he preached to keep the people in the dark while giving understanding to the disciples. And his reasons for doing so could be as simple as fulfilling prophecy. Granted, what is true for Jesus is not necessarily true for the disciples or for the rest of the church. So it's good to recognize that in the early church, she did conceal herself in times of persecution. An angel didn't decide to break Peter out of jail in the middle of the day. When did he wait to do it? In the middle of the night. Even when it comes to the preaching of the gospel, not everything is given to all men all at once. There is a deliberate method of who has the gospel, how it is revealed. St. Paul writes, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory." Then St. Paul, of course, says in the next chapter, when I addressed you, I addressed you as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. So I fed you with milk. You weren't yet ready for the solid food that had to be kept from you. Of course, this must be considered in light of rhetorical concerns, namely bringing to the consciences of the Corinthians, to their worldly shame, from which they should repent. Nevertheless, these distinctions, I believe, are very important. This distinction between mature, being able to handle more knowledge, and concealing things from the immature. That they make a difference as to the type of knowledge that is shared. Now, all of this should, of course, be held in tension with the clear and unambiguous admonitions of Jesus to preach the gospel, not as a secret, Gnostic way, but openly and boldly. Christ himself says of himself and his doctrine, "I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret." Now, so far, in going through this list, it's pretty much been descriptive. I'm not telling you how to do it or why it should happen. I'm just saying it happens. It's there, even with Jesus' admonitions to go and preach the gospel to the whole creation. Now, there are some suggestions as to how can we get to this biblical, godly understanding for a foundation for privacy. And one of the ways that is most popular among the academics and the scholarship that's out there is talking about the foundation of privacy as being the image of God. There's this speaker, blogger, writer out there named Jason Thacker, and he writes this: "Most modern Protestant moral ethics are based on the concept of human exceptionalism, or dignity based on the image of God, where God of the universe created every human creature in his image and bestowed on them a dignity above every part of creation." So there's one of the key parts for the classic definition, or the classic sort of reasoning behind a right to privacy: dignity. Now, I believe that everything hinges on what is meant by the image of God and what is meant by image bearing. Thacker goes on to explain, quote, "We live under the reign of the Creator God himself, who knows the deepest recesses of our souls as well as the faces that reveal our true personhood and individualism, image and personhood, and the necessity to protect that personhood from being violated or abused." Now, all of this is tightly bound together in his thinking. The fall into sin meant that men's individuality and their dignity had to be protected from the objectification of others, from the abuse of others. So we ought to protect ourselves and others from sinful abuse. When he considers, this is really interesting, in fact, if you're interested in this article, I could share it with you. When he considers facial recognition technology, he suggests the image-bearing dignity of the person, the knowing of another person according to the face, which is indeed a rich biblical theme. And he says that this is much more than just the data points and the algorithms that would be used to identify you, to gauge your inner state. Knowing a face is much more than capturing data. The face of God in the scriptures conveys both wrath and mercy. Man's face is either turned away from God in shame or lifted up in thanksgiving. This dignity of the person communicated through the face and with the facial metaphor cannot be reduced to information, no matter how hard the materialists of this age might try. Now, Thacker does good work in bringing out the theological implications of facial recognition technology. But like the rest of the literature, of course, he puts so much into this idea of the image of God that we possess and what it means to be an image bearer after the fall. The image is dignity bestowing, and that sounds good, but is it enough? Now, what if, I just want to suggest this for you folks in the room. What if the image of God is not a spark of lordly dignity through which we could recognize our mastery over ourselves in creation? What if, in fact, as the Lutherans believe, teach, and confess, the image of God is the original righteousness that Adam and Eve possessed that was lost by sin and restored through Christ? What if the image is merely the rational nature that separates us from the animals, as Augustine and the scholastics thought? If the image is the foundation for dignity, I still think there's a lot of work to get from that exalted status in creation to the place of privacy and secrecy. Now, I don't think that the image of God or the dignity language that comes from it is bad or not part of what, the foundation for privacy or secrecy. It's just that we need something to help get us across the finish line. Now, another attempt has been made at founding a theological foundation for privacy, and this has been suggested by Adrian Reeder. He also acknowledges the incompatibility of autonomy and our createdness, and that's good. He helpfully points out the voices of the critics out there who say that the Bible as a source of faith is extremely lacking in information on the concept of privacy. Even if it's a fact in the scriptures, it doesn't tell us why. Now, if the goal is to find analogies for the secular ideas of dignity, which stresses the exalted state of the person, or in finding like a kind of a substitute for autonomy in the Holy Scriptures, I'd have to agree. The Bible is not going to be helping us too much. And this is why this approach the approach he suggests is so intriguing. He starts with the typical Protestant points of departure, like the sovereignty of God, the justice of God, and the universal dignity of being image bearers of God. But then he brings in language that's very familiar to Lutherans. He talks about the hidden and the revealed God. He gets the second hand through more Protestant writers like Karl Barth, but Luther explains it best. There is a distinction in what can be known about God. There is that which God reveals about himself, like his love for you and the death and resurrection of Christ, how Christ is in fact his beloved Son, in whom he is well pleased. But there are also things that God forbids us to know, and he keeps hidden. He doesn't want us to see, which is to say that the almighty, perfect, and eternal God keeps secrets. He has privacy. From the time of Adam to our own, God conceals much, cloaks himself in darkness, will only be grasped by faith in his Son. All else is speculation and perhaps even error. Moses never saw God's face. Even though he received the greatest revelations of the Old Covenant, the name of God, the commandments of God, when Moses asked to see God, God said, "You can only see my butt, my backside." On the other hand, Jesus says that he alone knows the Father, and the Father alone knows him, which means that the quality of knowledge shared between the Father and the Son is absolutely distinct and different from the kind of knowledge that's shared by other people. And I'll get into more of that soon. Whenever we talk about Jesus being the only way to the Father, this is what we mean. That God conceals himself in every other part of creation. Instead, he wants to be known through the incarnate one. Because God both hides and reveals his person, Reader writes, God himself decides what information will be made known to the human being, and thus the principle of confidentiality in the conception of God is confirmed. The human being, as the image of God, also has a right to confidentiality, which means the human being himself or herself can decide what information may leave the privacy of his or her being as human. That's his argument. And it's intriguing, but it depends on an analogy whose validity depends on what is meant by the image of God. Again, by way of a kind of analogy of being, the assertion is that since God can hide parts of himself, and man being a bearer of the image, he should also hide parts of himself. Again, from Isaiah 55, and this is where I think that yes, I do believe there is an analogy of being, but it can't be applied so glibly as he wants it to be. Like God has privacy, therefore man has privacy. Instead, God speaks against this kind of thinking often in the scriptures, where he says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God is the creator. We are creatures. Just because we share in the quality of existence, a gift from God, just because we have been set apart from the rest of creation as the pinnacle of creation, to be fruitful, to multiply, to subdue creation, just because we've even been sanctified by grace through faith does not mean that we imitate God in all his ways. It is not for us to kill and to make alive. It is not for us to know all things. Now, this is the option I would like to suggest to you, and maybe but not suggest in such a way that you understand that this is an avenue for probably future thinking, research, development. This is by no means the answer. I think it is perhaps an answer. Now, Neil Messer, at his work on privacy in light of AI's capacity to read and interpret brain states, which I'm sure Robin Phillips will be talking about more tomorrow, he wisely points us back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose study of Genesis 3 brings him to the conclusion that not all knowledge is benign. The desire to know God as he is in himself, to be, as the serpent said, wise like God, led to transgression that doomed our whole race to death and hell. While Messer draws on Bonhoeffer to articulate a critical distinction between knowing a person through what they say versus going on to know the depths of their being, that is, I suppose they're what we would call, as Westerners, your mind. It occurred to me that everything that we really need to know about privacy hinges on the different kinds of knowing that exist between God and man in the church, between the husband and wife in marriage, between parents and children in the family, and between neighbors in the world. In fact, I think that if you look at the institutions of God's holy estates, getting back to something that David brought in, the family, the church, civil society, you'll find the scriptures are full of admonitions of how much can be shared or what should be kept private. These distinctions, especially in the cases of the church and the family, are instituted importantly prior to the fall of sin into sin and continue to have relevance for God's people in both the Old and the New Testaments. Now, for those of you who need a sort of refresher, or if you've never heard of the doctrine, the Lutheran doctrine of the three estates, you have to realize that this is not the tripartite division of medieval European society between the nobility, the clergy, and the peasants. Rather, Luther came to understand the three estates through God's creative instituting word in the scriptures, through his careful study of the Ten Commandments, and through the table of duties in the New Testament that are written, that you find by Saints Peter and Paul. Now, I'm going to skip over some larger block quotes here just for the sake of time. Like I said before, the church and the family are instituted in paradise. The church was instituted when the Lord spoke to Adam. By the sermon, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, lest you die," the Lord granted Adam a word by which mankind would believe the Lord and live, by which fellowship between God and man in the church was established by hearing the word of God and faith. God gives himself immediately through the word, though he knows us as a potter knows his own vessel. So even if there's not an equal sharing, it is a life-giving sharing, mediated and measured, of an almighty creator providing for the needs and the future of his creature. The psalmist writes, "If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a foreign God, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. And St. Paul makes clear the difference between knowing God now in the weakness of our flesh and knowing him in glory. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. The Lord showed his extensive knowledge in Eden and later through the scriptures. Though men forgot God since they could not see him, God never forgot them. He not only saw their actions and their thoughts and their intentions of the heart, as it says in Genesis 6, were continually evil. It was no accident. It was not for wrath or judge or even condemnation that that God came walking in the cool of the day in the garden to pronounce judgments against sin and to promise life through the gospel. His knowledge and judgment, importantly, discern more than the brain states of his creation. His knowledge encompasses, and this is important, the heart. For the Lord sees not as man sees. The Lord looks on the outward appearance, but man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. An amazing thing happens when the Lord reveals himself to us by his word and gives us Christ. Though the Lord may not tell us everything, it turns out that he does disclose the most important part of himself, the deepest, most meaningful part of himself to us. It is significant that the word of God does the work of discerning the human heart, as St. Paul says in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. Because being known by God through his powerful, gracious word is gaining knowledge of God's own deepest feelings, intentions, and affections. Jesus turns his enemies to the word to discover their God's heart. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came to call the righteous, but not the righteous, but sinners. And again, through Ezekiel 18, have I any pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that he should turn from his way and live. And Jesus says, of course, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and believed that I came from God. So we are known by God now as Christians through Christ, through his death for our sakes, by which our sins have been imputed to the sinless Son of God, forever washed away by his blood. We now know God through Christ by faith in the word. This kind of knowing is called idolatry if it's applied to anything outside of the estate of the church. If I give the fears, loves, and trusts of my heart to another being, a piece of creation, or a creature like myself, when I try to know God apart from the word which gives me Christ, when I try to know another person's heart, as God alone knows the secrets of the heart, I wander into the darkness of idolatry, unbelief, and sin. Adam and Eve desired this, to know God as God knew himself. They desired to know creation as God knew creation. But again, they did not gain wisdom, they gained death. Now, as the Lord knows his saints and the saints know the Lord, so God has also instituted for help, procreation, and love in this world with our closest neighbors, our spouses, who are the bone of our bone and the flesh of our flesh. Adam and Eve were created naked and unashamed in a garden, that is, at least until their hearts and their minds were corrupted by sin, which turned them from receiving creation as a gift from God's hand to imagine new, abusive, greedy, and selfish uses of this earth. Bonhoeffer was right to draw our attention to the garden after the fall to see the coverings that even God makes for them. Nevertheless, the command to be fruitful and multiply was still in full effect even after the fall. Moses teaches, and Christ repeats, that a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, the consummation of this union in the Old Testament, many of you know already, of course, is called, in the Hebrew idiom, knowing. Now, Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. The marital union is knowledge between one man and one woman for the procreation of children. In this lifelong union until God parts them in death. The old lexicons call this carnal knowledge, which I, which I think leaves much to the explanation of what's being done there. There's so much more than just a euphemism for, doing the baby-making thing. Adam has been given knowledge of his wife that is for him and for him alone. He is entrusted with her whole being, having charge over her body and her soul. Every pastor who teaches premarital counseling classes knows that the one-flesh union goes so far beyond just what the body does. It encompasses faithfully holding each other's thoughts, dreams, their secrets, and yes, even covering for your spouse's mistakes and sins. For someone outside to gain this knowledge that's given from husband to wife, according to God's desire and design, that person would be committing a kind of adultery. Not just a kind of, it is adultery. It's marital unfaithfulness. It makes foul the purity of their union. And of course, not just necessarily with their bodies. In the same way, it follows that the fruit of the union, the children, are to share in the familial knowledge among one another. It is the most natural thing in the world for a mother to know her daughter in a way that a stranger never can, nor does he have the right to. When it comes to the third estate, of course, of the civil government, they clearly neither have the privileged access of knowing a man's heart in the sense that God knows the man's heart, nor the knowledge of a husband for his wife. I know that during the COVID excitement, the working assumption of many was that Romans chapter 13 justified the government's godlike powers to restrict and to monitor our lives in whatever way they really wanted. But when the nature of the virus and the government's inability to stop its spread became immediately apparent, it's interesting that rather than relinquishing their control, their invasive monitoring and dictating people's movements continued. It was just recently, within weeks, I think, that the CDC stopped receiving your location data from your cell phones as part of their COVID tracking measures. The government seemed to think itself capable of becoming God's surrogate in people's minds and hearts. They were willing to do anything, and the people, and they were willing to do anything they asked, at whatever cost to their physical, emotional, and spiritual lives. These folks who thought that Romans 13 really justified the government invading into these places where the family ought to exist, or the church. The examples of godly resistance to this godlike intrusion into people's lives have already been mentioned above, most notably with the Egyptian midwives who lied in a godly way to Pharaoh, and concerning the wise men who refused to share their information with the sovereign Herod, despite his official request. Simply put, Christ's admonition gives a lot of clarity and wisdom. Therefore, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and the things and to God the things that are God's. Now, what has been given to Caesar? Not your intimate one-flesh knowledge between you and your wife, not even the knowledge you share between you and your children, not even the knowledge that you share between you and your neighbor. Remember Paul's instruction and admonition. The sphere of authority granted to the government by God is to punish evil and to reward good. And to accomplish this mission, they must collect taxes, which they are owed. The St. Peter says, "For because of this you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now, this is, I think, a far cry from the assumption that government has the right to know just about everything about you. The same thing should and can be applied to the idea of, so the same thing ought to be applied to, of course, corporations, business entities, these transnational entities that have money and power analogous to that of a government. These are the ones who are providing us with the screens, with the programs that we use, with the browsers, who log the keystrokes. And this is really what it comes down to. Are they, in fact, privileged to have the deep knowledge that you're sharing on your screen? Now, I understand that you have to engage with your neighbors to get stuff done, to live a life, to have a business, right? There are times when it's necessary that you have to give your credit card information to the person that you want to purchase from, right? Do you trust in making that purchase that you're not being swindled, that your information isn't being arbitrarily shared with others? At the same time, what I really want us to be aware of is that God wants you to be careful about how much others know, especially about your family, your own spiritual state, which you share with God through your, going to confession and absolution with your pastor. How, in fact, you have been entrusted with many of your neighbors' darkest, deepest secrets and even their sins. And even if you are of the attitude that you can and should live an absolute open life, let them hear anything they want about me, let them learn anything they want about me, you are not your own person. There are things that are yours that belong only to your wife, that belong only to your children, that belong only to God. There are things, there are truths and knowledge that belong away from the ears of government, business, your browser, And so to help sort of exercise ourselves in this distinction of knowing what belongs to God, what belongs to my wife, what belongs to my family, what belongs to my neighbor, and what belongs to the government. I think a good exercise in this way would be to study, of course, the eighth commandment, that you should not bear false witness about your neighbor. In studying the eighth commandment, you see that God entrusts you with secrets, not for your own sake, but for your neighbor's sake. And Luther, of course, just wonderfully, I have it here. If you want the full manuscript, you can ask me for it later, whatever. But Luther has these great quotes where he says, so you've seen your neighbor across the fence commit a sin. Oh, okay. And you want to tell everybody about it, as if seeing a sin implies that everybody ought to know about the sin. Luther says that's not true. If you've seen a wrongdoing, go report it to the God-given authorities within the estates who have the direct instructions from God to punish evil. And then, in this imaginary conversation that Luther has with the person that he's talking to, the person says, well, I don't want to do that. I don't have any proof. And then he says something like, uses a funny German idiom like, oh, can you now smell the roast? Meaning that just because there is knowledge of a thing, just because you witness something that is sinful on his or her part, if you are not prepared to bear witness in a court of law, right, and for your testimony to be supported by evidence and cross-examination, then you have no right to share that sin with others in gossip. Because your neighbor's good name and reputation is a gift from God, a gift worthy of protection, a gift that requires secrets and privacy. Also, as a final note, the confessional seal. There's this great paper in Logia by Craig Meisner, this pastor in the Northern Illinois district. And he wrote this, that at a pastor's conference, the pastors were sitting together with a bunch of district officials, and the topic of the confessional seal came up. And he said that he was shocked and amazed by how so many pastors didn't want to talk about the sacredness of the seal and the great obligation that has been put upon them to be the bearers of their neighbor's sin. Instead, they were wanting to talk about all of the times when they had to actually break the seal for various reasons, right? Well, what if the law says this? Then I have to go and report. What if the person says it to me, but I don't think they were actually serious when it came to, their resolution to be done with that sin? Is it okay then to go and, share that sin with someone else so I can bring in backup or something like that? In Matthew chapter 18, of course, the Lord tells us what to do in the cases of unrepentant sin. But as pastors in this room know, and as every Christian in this room knows, when somebody comes to you and they confess their sin to you, you are to become as Christ to that person by doing what? What do? Somebody confesses their sin to you. What do you say? I forgive you. In the name of Jesus. Jesus has died for your sin. This sin has been washed away by his blood, right? Which means that sin has been removed from that person as far as the east is from the west, using the language of Isaiah. And what this means is that you are left with knowledge of sin in this life, right, that now belongs to Christ, that has been washed away by his blood, and it is not for you to share that guilt and shame ever. Ever. So just by meditating on these two things, the eighth commandment, that your neighbor has a reputation, it's your duty to protect it, even when it comes to keeping his secrets for him, his shameful secrets. And by meditating on the confessional seal, that the sins that are confessed to you as a pastor and even as a layperson, they now belong to Christ. Even if you know about them, they belong to nobody else. This helps us to understand the boundaries of the different kinds of knowing. The privileged knowing between God and the Christian, right? This is where the confessional seal comes in. Between a person and his neighbor, which is where the eighth commandment comes in, right? And even in the kind of knowledge that ought to be shared between a person and what you have in the government. Can it be backed up by evidence? Are you ready to be cross-examined? Are you ready to stand up in court, right? Is your evidence willing to be put next to the evidence or the testimony of two or three others? All right, so just as a quick conclusion, know whose good name you're protecting when you're always engaging with social media, right? Know that you've been entrusted with, of course, truths not only about yourself, but about others. And so if you do use social media, just do so with knowing that you are a caretaker, a steward of secrets. Being mindful of where the knowledge that you have belongs according to the estates. And this is really important, I think, for the pastors who are out there. Use secure technologies when discussing the sensitive issues of pastoral care. Did you know that SMS messaging, your native texting app on your phone, it's been this way for a very long time, I can attest to. I was in signals intelligence when I was in the Marine Corps as an Arabic linguist, okay? I'll let you try to figure out what that means. But what I can tell you that everybody ought to know is that your texting, your SMS messages are completely in the open. Anybody with the right kind of technology, which probably at this point isn't that hard to obtain, can just sift through the air, finding text, the things that are said between people who assume that the things that are being said is private. Between me, the screen, and the person on the other side. We can't be that naive, especially since so much of our pastoral care happens through a screen. I mean, how often do the pastors in this room get text messages saying, Pastor, I need advice. I need help. Pastor, can you please pray for this on Sunday, right? Pastor, I've committed this sin again. Can we please set up a time to talk? That doesn't need to be in the open air, right? So I'm not saying that you're sinning by not using Signal or something like that. What I am saying is that it is something we should be thinking about. And as pastors, I think it's a worthy endeavor to tell your board of elders or other members of the congregation, look, if you want to talk to me and have a conversation of pastoral care, of things that may fall under the confessional seal, that is, the things that concern sin and the righteousness of Christ and the forgiving power of his blood, then let's use a technology or a tool that is actually going to keep us as close to the true face-to-face interaction that God intends. We ought to be having that conversation. All right, so any questions for me? We're at the end of our time for this evening, and I went a little bit long. Like I said, there's more there, and if you're interested, I do have a spare manuscript that I can share or even email it to you. So you can, think through this idea of there are different kinds of knowing, not only different kinds of knowing, but different sort of bodies of knowledge or different things that ought to be shared in different places as we understand according to the estates and the Ten Commandments. Questions, thoughts? Yes, sir.
A lot of good stuff. Thank you for the paper. It's very good. I will want to get an email manuscript. Two things. First, the fact that the right to privacy, as it's articulated and enshrined really now in America, was only discovered in the Constitution in the 1960s. And so I think that bears engagement by us theologically to look at how they found it, as you know, in the Doe versus Bolton case, a case regarding contraception that absolutely paved the way for Roe versus Wade, and then for abortion, for the murder, the slaughter of millions of innocent children. So I'm going to say the danger of the concept of privacy and how it can be misused, I think, bears some scrutiny there.
Absolutely, especially since privacy as a right is founded on what? Autonomy. Lordship over one's body, and without the absolutely necessary understanding that you are not your own, that you are a creature under God, right?
Yes. A second resource that is available and is not infallible but worthy of study is a CTCR document that was produced about 20 years ago now on the public rebuke of public sin with respect to the Eighth Commandment. Yeah. And they wrestled with this whole notion of privacy as it is understood today, and really had a very interesting analysis of how that notion really did not exist in Luther's day. So much of what we today consider private and privileged was absolutely common and public in Luther's day.
Yeah. Like I said, I think that's a good point, because it points us again to the Holy Scriptures, the articulation of the estates, the different kinds of knowing, right? And from there, you can kind of build out a genuine biblical privacy, not one that's been arbitrarily handed down to us on this foundation of autonomy, right? Which can encompass a ton of things. It used to be, and this was, I think, a wonderful thing, that when somebody got sick in your parish and they went to the hospital, what happened? The hospital gave you a call and said, hey, look, so-and-so got injured in a car wreck. They're here right now. Please come, because we recognize the value of you, the pastor, to come and administer pastoral care in that situation, to speak God's comforting word in that time of distress, right? And that is no longer done because of these HIPAA laws, right? So the HIPAA laws, there's no doubt they're preserving some things that are certainly good, but in their articulation of privacy based on autonomy, they end up cutting out things that ought not to be cut out, like the pastor being informed when somebody ends up in the hospital. Yeah. I thought I saw another hand up here. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
I'm really confused. I'm talking about a government that is hostile and legally hostile. I'm talking about the right to non-incrimination, not search and seizure. I'm in a whole different thing. I think it's naive to say, oh, I'm a Christian. And if you want to come arrest me because I'm reading the Bible, well, I'll just be proud for that. Well, I hope to be that way. I do. But that does not make it benign that the government is hostile, it is illegal, and it is persecuting me for things that in this country have always been protected by law. I'm not talking about I want to sneak around and commit adultery. I'm just want to, speak freely.
Yes.
And so, the right to privacy in terms of an omnipotent, omniscient God is really not my issue. It's a wonderful thing to understand, and you brought me brand new thoughts. It's exciting in many ways. But my problem is I've got a hostile government that wants to put me in jail, and they will enjoy harming me until I die. And people from the insurrection on January 6th, there's still many of them in jail, horrible conditions. So I'm not doing that voluntarily. No, thank you. And that's kind of my concern. My privacy is an issue only if they're going to use it to incriminate me falsely, and that's what we're facing.
So realize that at the beginning of the lecture, I was trying to articulate to the best of my ability, trying to give the best explanation of the kind of bravado that I've heard from other pastors. That's what I was doing. And I was correcting it by suggesting that privacy is real and necessary.
I think what you quoted by the professors is naive. I mean, I have nothing to hide. Well, that's great because it doesn't matter.
Well, and this is an important understanding that comes out of the estates. Luther understood this, and when he would talk about the duties.
And I'm long gone to hell anyway. Yeah.
No, so you're a Christian, right? God bless you. Jesus has died for you. So Luther will talk about how it is the duty of the pastor within the estate of the church to preach not only to the families, right, of the parish, but also to the government that is immediately responsible. And so even Luther in his day understood that the government is not this absolute power that gets to do whatever it wants. Rather, it often does, often commits sin. And whose duty is it to speak to that sin? The church, especially the ministers of the church, right? And so even if we ought to live in such a way that we're blameless before the government, that doesn't mean that we should be silent when it comes to the government. Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else? Before they kick us out of here? Yes.
So at one point, you seem to say that the right to confidentiality rests with the agent to decide what is private, if I understood you correctly. And what would you say to somebody who took that as legitimizing a type of privacy absolutism and going into a type of libertarian model where you can't even, you have a right not to have a breath test, or the police can't even question you about your alibi, your car can't be searched at the border, for example? What would you say to somebody who took it to that extreme?
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like that quote was from, I was quoting a scholar who was probably either one of the people who was founding privacy on autonomy or somebody who was using like the image of God as like a substitute for autonomy to say that, well, I need this space so I can form and sort of develop and protect personhood and how the world interacts with my person. Now, for such a person, I would say that I would tell them to study the scriptures, to understand from the plenteous examples of the scriptures that we live in such a way that we live for our neighbors first, right? That in fact, whenever we look at the commandments, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, realize that those commandments are not articulating rights for you. What are they doing? They're in fact protecting what God has given to your neighbor, right? And so far from, I think, so if somebody wants to go that way, that libertarian way of saying, well, I get to choose and set up my own boundaries of privacy, I would say, well, already the Lord says that it can't go that way because I'm putting a neighbor into your life, your spouse, your kids, even the government tax man, who are going to be coming to you demanding things from you, and you owe them things. So by looking at the estates, by meditating upon the scriptures that institute the estates, by looking at the application of the estates in the lives of the saints of the Old and New Testaments, we can learn a lot about where the boundaries really exist. And it's not up to us to figure out where to put up the walls, but God has done it for us. And when we do it in our own way and try to articulate our own privacy, that's when we wander into sin. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Jared, do you have anything? I was thinking about you the whole time I was writing this. I'm like, Jared is really looking forward to a theology of privacy. So, yeah. So, like David said, I'm going to be around the whole time, of course. If you have thoughts, if you would like to see the manuscript, to pour over it, to give me your feedback, I would love that. I think that this is one of the more helpful things that we can do as the Catacombs and coming together is we recognize that privacy is important. It's really important for us to understand as Christians, why is that the case? So thank you, everybody.